Hello everyone and welcome to the long-awaited match from round 4 of the Oslo Esports Cup. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Praggnanandhaa. They are both having a pretty good event, but Praggnanandhaa is having an immaculate event. He won all three of his matches with perfect scores, and is here in the Oslo Esports Cup you get more money if you win games than if you actually draw and then win in tiebreaks. After 3 matches, Praggnanandhaa has already won, I believe, $22,000 or somewhere around that number. So while that is very impressive, we are here to enjoy chess, and this is one match that we were looking forward to very much. Magnus has the white pieces, and he opens with e4. Praggu opens with c5, or rather counters e4 with c5. He goes for the Sicilian defense, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now bishop to b5. Magnus goes for the Nimzovich-Rossolimo attack against the Sicilian, as he often does. We have g6 by Praggu, castles by Magnus, and now bishop to g7. We have d3 and knight to f6. We have bishop captures on c6, d captures on c6, and now Magnus goes rook to e1. Preparing to advance the e5 pawn. You could advance the e5 pawn right away, but here Magnus is still waiting with the idea. So here we have castles by Praggu, and now pawn to h3. We have queen to c7, and only now Magnus pushes e5. So the position has been reached before, however, only in a handful of games, and e5 was never played here. So as of move 9, we have a completely new game. We have knight to d5, and now knight b to d2. And now, as the bishop no longer controls the f4 square, Praggu shifts his knight over to f4. Magnus plays knight to e4, opens up an attack on the knight here, and now bishop captures on e5. So it's a temporary pawn sacrifice, but, well, as you'll see, only a temporary one. Knight captures on e5, queen captures on e5, and here knight to c3. Now challenging the queen. Also, the queen has to keep an eye on the knight on f4. So queen back to c7, Magnus picks up the knight, queen captures on f4, and now we have rook captures on e7. Magnus wins back the pawn. But Praggu says not so quick. Bishop captures on h3. And now it's in fact Praggu who is up a pawn, but Magnus again grabs the b7 pawn. Rook captures on b7. Now, if you're wondering what happens if g captures on h3, well, you could play this, then comes queen to g5 check, and you blunder the rook on e7. So instead, we have rook captures on b7, and now Praggu just goes back, bishop to c8. You could play bishop to f5, bishop to e6, but he has a very specific idea. He wants to limit the movement of the rook, so Magnus goes rook to e7, and now bishop to e6. So now, if you're not careful, a move like queen to f6 could be, or queen to d6 could be a lot of trouble for you. So Magnus goes queen to c1. You could also consider queen to f3, but queen to c1 is a little bit stronger for white, as you'll see. Magnus has 7 minutes on the clock, whereas Praggu has 3.5 minutes. So that is going well for Magnus. And here, for example, if queen to d6, which of course is an idea, you don't want to play queen g5. You cannot defend the rook because f6, and then you just blunder the rook again. But a rook to b7, and then after bishop to c8, challenging the rook, we're going to play knight to e4. This was Carlsen's idea. And after queen e5, we're going to play rook to b3. Now comes c4. Of course, the rook is attacked. If you capture, then you lose the knight. So rook to c3, and now after something like captures, it is white who will be putting pressure on black's position. So instead, we have queen to h4 by Praggu, and now rook to c7, going after the double c pawns. And here, while you could play something like bishop to d5, and it's probably the something to do, for example, captures, and captures. Praggu doesn't like this, so he plays c4. Very active way to play. D captures on c4, queen captures on c4, now keeping an eye on the c6 pawn, and queen to e3. And now you have to decide. Now, probably bishop to f5 going after the c2 pawn is better in the long run, but these are all rapid games, as I often remind you. So bishop to d5 was played, and now Magnus simply captures it. Knight captures on d5, queen captures on d5, and now rook captures on a7, grabbing that pawn. And you can see now that Magnus is up a pawn. Not only that, he has the passed a pawn. So here we have rook back to e8, attacking the queen here. Rook to e7, not allowing to give up the e-file, and here we have a trade. Captures, and now queen to d4, putting pressure on the b2 pawn. And we have c3 and queen to d2. Now, Magnus still has 6 minutes on the clock, whereas Praggu has 2 minutes. How do you defend the pawn? While you could play something like rook to b1 after queen to c2, attacking the rook, it's a very annoying position. You have to play very passive, play the queen back to e1, and now after rook to b8, how do you defend the b2 pawn? If you push it, then you lose the a2 pawn. And so on. So instead, after queen d2, Magnus plays queen to b7, defends his pawn, also puts pressure on the c6 pawn, and here we have rook to e8 by Praggu, activating the rook. You could try something like h5 and say, okay, let's just go all out, let white do his thing on the queen side, but it's not all that impressive. Let's say h4, we can even play queen captures on c6, h3. Okay, you open up the king a little bit, but white really doesn't care here. So instead, after queen to b7, we have rook to e8. Praggu now wants to trade rooks and go into queen and pawn endgame. Queen captures on c6, and now rook to e1 with check. Magnus captures, we have queen captures, and now king to h2, and queen captures on f2. So this is the queen and pawn endgame that we are talking about, where Magnus has 3 connected pass pawns on the queen side. But it's queen and pawn endgame, that just might not be enough. And you have to play it very precisely, and Magnus does play it very precisely. Queen to e8 with check, king g7, now queen to e5 with check, we have f6, and now queen to e7 with check. King to h6, king to g8 could be a bit more resilient, but Praggu wants to hide his king so he can start giving checks. If Magnus is not very careful, queen to h4 followed by queen to e1 could result in a perpetual, for example, if Magnus loses control over the e1 square. So here we have b4. This is not possible for the moment, as Magnus does control the e1 square. And now comes queen to f4. If you capture on a2, then we capture on f6, and then it's just, of course, winning for white. So after b4, we have queen to f4 check. Now, Praggu is hoping to get some sort of a perpetual here. King to g1, now comes queen to c1 check, king f2, queen to d2 check, and now queen to e2. Magnus blocks the check, hopes to trade queens, and now queen to f4 with check. We have queen to f3, queen back to d2 check, and king g3. So Praggu prevents Carlsen's king from going to the queen side, and he asks, what do you do now? So first, king g7. Now you have a bit more options because, well, for example, if you have the king on f3 and let's say queen f3 check is played, then Praggu will be forced to trade queens. This way he can, use a bit more space. So a4, Magnus starts pushing the pass pawn. We have queen to g5 with check. King f2, queen back to d2 check, queen to e2. Now queen captures on c3. Magnus could try something else, but he decides that giving up the pawn is the best way to seize advantage. So queen e2, queen captures on c3, and now queen to e7 with check. And this is a very good move by Magnus because it puts Praggu's king in complete passivity. Of course, king to h6 is no longer possible because now queen to e3 check, we trade queens, and now, of course, the position is just winning for white. The passed a pawn is too fast. So here we have king to g8, and now we have a5. Starting to push those pass pawns. We have queen to d2 with check, king to g3, now comes g5. And here Magnus has to be very careful. If he pushes a pawn and doesn't look what Praggu is doing, just queen f4 check, king h3, and queen to h4 will be checkmate. So Magnus first plays queen captures on f6. This picks up a pawn while defending against checkmate, and now it's going to be very hard for Praggu to defend this. Queen to e1 check, we have queen to f2, now comes queen captures on b4. Magnus even gives up the b pawn because now he says the a pawn is winning. We have queen to f5 defending and attacking the pawn. So queen to e1 with check, king to g4, and now we have queen to b4 with check. Again, if you play queen to e2 check, we just capture on g5, and okay, here you could capture on g2, and this is probably what could have happened, but after queen to e2 check, well, yeah, you kind of can't capture this. You have to go back, and then Magnus would have to figure out a different way to play this. But Praggu played queen to b4 check, and this allows Magnus to just continue pushing. King captures on g5, queen to d2 with check. We have king to h5, and now queen to d6. Cutting off the king from going to h6. This would help a lot in trying to checkmate the black king, but also keeping an eye on the a6 square so Magnus can't just continue pushing the pawn. And also you are threatening queen to h2 check. The king has to move, and then you're going to pick up the g2 pawn with check. So Magnus blocks this with g3. And it's quite a tricky idea. If queen captures, then queen g5 check, just trades queens, and then Carlsen's a pawn will be winning. So after g3, Praggu plays queen to c6, and now we have king to g5. King to g7, and now queen to e5 with check. King f7, queen to f4 with check, and now king to g7. Now, interestingly, both players are now below the 1 minute mark. We have queen to d4 check, king to g8, and now queen to b6. Magnus spent quite a lot of time, since he only had a minute left on the clock, to calculate this queen to b6 idea, but it is an idea that definitely works, as you'll see. Queen d5 check. We have king to f6, and now comes queen to f3 with check. King to e7, and now comes queen to a3 with check. So this is the idea that Magnus was calculating. Now white is completely winning here, but you have to play a very, very precise move. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find the absolute best move for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this brilliant idea. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is queen to d6. That's the good stuff. Now, you could just move the king and you would probably still be able to win, but this just forces a win. And now capturing this pawn doesn't work because Praggu's king is in a mating net. If queen captures an a5, we just play queen e6 check, king g7, queen f6 check, king g8 forced, and now queen to f8 will be checkmate. So here, after queen to d6, Praggu played queen to f3, but now Magnus can finally continue pushing his pass pawn. We have queen to f7 with check, king to d8, now comes queen to a2, but it doesn't help. King to c7, Carlsen's king finally reaches the queen side, queen to f7 check, king to b6, now comes queen to b3 check, king to a7, queen to f7 check, now king to a8. We have queen to f3 with check. We have king to b8, queen to b3, and finally king to c8. We have queen to c4, checking the king, attacking the pawn, so you have to be careful. But now king to b7, and after queen to b3 check, queen to b6. Now we can finally start blocking check with our queen. Queen f3 check, king to a7, and now, of course, you cannot deliver a check because we're just gonna block with the queen. So queen to a3 was played, but now we have king to a8, king to g7. Again, a check along the back rank doesn't work because we just block with our queen and force a queen trade. So after king a8, king to g7 was played, but now a7. And we are very close to the end. Queen to f8, queen to f8 with check. We have king to b7, queen to f3 with check, queen to c6, queen to b3 with check, and here Magnus played king to c8, and it was in this position on move 76 that Praggnanandhaa resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So once you deliver one more check, let's say queen to g8 check, king to c7 will be played, and then there are no more useful checks because after queen f7 we can just block with our queen, and of course the king and pawn endgame is winning for Magnus. So a very nice game, very, very nicely fought by Praggu, but Magnus was very resilient. He was well accustomed to the line. After that bishop captures on h3 idea very early on in the game, Magnus was very quick to just follow up with rook captures on b7, even though the position is incredibly complicated, but he knew what was happening, and Praggu had to waste more time than Magnus did, and in the end Magnus used that very well in this queen and pawn endgame. So after king to c8, Praggu resigned, and the game one of this well, very, very anticipated match goes to Magnus Carlsen. So yeah, that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it and that you were able in spotting that queen to d6 idea. It's not an easy one to find, especially since you have to give up the pass pawn that you've been protecting for so long, but that's what it sometimes takes to win a queen and pawn endgame, and it is most likely what Magnus was calculating here when he spent a lot of time going for this queen to b6 idea. But yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see if Praggu can bounce back. Like we said, he won all 3 matches he played so far. Will he be able to bounce back against Magnus and maybe win the 4th one? We'll see what happens. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Andrew Dabrowski, Kirsten Lemons, Guy for Scores, DK Benjamin, and Mark Galassi for contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this, very enjoyable cup, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon and have an excellent rest of your day. And yes, for those of you who have been asking in the comment section of the previous video, Meadow did definitely have some of the fish. So see you soon.